Okay. Dana Grieco researches the impact of climate change on coral reef fisheries and how conservation can mitigate these effects. And her interdisciplinary work aims to improve sustainable outcomes for these fisheries by advancing research methods and informing practical fisheries management. Without further ado, Dana, welcome. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm excited to kind of close out the Wednesdays at the Center and tell y'all a little bit about what I'm doing. So this talk is going to be very broad. It's kind of focusing on systems thinking and how we can use systems thinking to understand the system overall, the entire coral reef system, and then how we might be able to use conservation as a way to mitigate those impacts. And I got into coral reef systems. I know that everyone kind of loves coral reefs, and they're these really fun and exciting systems. But I also got into them because they're data poor in lots of areas of the world. So there's very little data that we have a lot of times about coral reef systems and how they're functioning, how much fish we're fishing from those systems, how we're doing that. And so my goal with this research and my goal kind of with my greater career overall is just to kind of give larger voice to these data poor systems and think about other ways that we can understand data poor fisheries without necessarily needing to just collect more data. So I feel like it's really pertinent, hopefully, in kind of today's world as we're potentially losing funding for different research and types of data to be able to say, okay, well, what are the other ways that we can understand these systems, and how can we leverage that to do research that maybe doesn't have as much data behind it in the sense of how we're using data right now. So what other types of data can we bring in to understand these systems? So coral reef systems in general, they have a host of challenges. One being that they're these really complex interconnected systems. So there's huge connections between the social aspects of the systems and the ecological aspects of the systems. They can often be data deficient, so like I just talked about. The evidence is scattered a lot of times between social research and ecological research, and so there can be these big disciplinary silos. In addition, these are kind of multi-species, multi-gear fisheries a lot of times. So if you're trying to understand the fisheries, it's really hard to pull all of that data together and understand how we're depleting the ecosystems. And they're extremely threatened by anthropogenic factors like pollution, development, and of course climate change. So coral reef systems are extremely threatened by climate change. These are all pictures from the Caribbean Investigative Journalism Network, and they do a lot of really great journalism work on understanding different impacts that maybe aren't getting a voice in the Caribbean. But this is true for all tropical systems globally. For coral reef systems, they're some of the most threatened ecosystems that we have from climate change. And so this figure kind of shows this risk to fishing as a result of climate change. So it's by Chung et al. 2018, and it's essentially showing the risk if we keep the status quo of climate emissions as they are to fisheries globally. It's a bit hard to see the details, but you can see that the band kind of across the tropics has a greater risk index to it. And what that means is that fishing kind of as we know it and with the species that are more heavily fished is at risk in those areas as well. And like I mentioned earlier, coral reef fisheries can be kind of have a wide variety of fishing. So they can have things like your classic line fishing, where you're literally throwing a hook and line into the water. Cast netting, where you're throwing a net out. Gill netting often happens off of a boat. Spear fishing, diving. And so all of these different fisheries target different fish, or they're less targeting a fish. And a lot of times they're pulling up fish on the reef for subsistence as well, so for directly feeding local communities. And so when we're trying to figure out kind of how these systems are impacted by climate change, there's this new work emerging in fisheries that's all focused on ecosystem-based fisheries management. And what that means is that we're studying predator-prey interactions, habitat, climate impacts on these entire systems, and how fishing and other extractive activities can also impact these systems. And we're trying to look at all of that in a systems-wide lens together using the available data at hand. And so when we think about data itself and kind of the different knowledge that we can use, we have this idea of Western knowledge and technology. A lot of that has been brought into this idea of what science is and how science works as we know it. We also have indigenous knowledge, which can be extremely important, especially at a systems level, and local knowledge. And so a huge part of my work and kind of what I'm really hoping to do is understand how local knowledge can be used to enhance ecosystem-based fisheries management and enhance how we understand the entire system. And to do that, we can use tools such as systems mapping. So systems mapping is a way that you can get different stakeholders together and ask them to just draw connections in the system. So between overfishing and different reef fish populations, for example, between increasing sea surface temperature and coral bleaching, we can kind of ask them what they're seeing on the water in the communities and how things are impacting them. And this can be a really useful tool to glean that local knowledge about the system, especially in areas where there's less data on fish catch in general or how the ecosystems are doing. And so this is also a little light, but essentially we can use these systems mapping processes to create these directed graphs. And these directed maps have these nodes that allow us to see the connections really easily between one cause and another effect, and however folks are describing that connection. So this is that same figure a bit bigger. And these systems maps serve as visual tools, and one of the reasons that they're so important is that they can help compile all of this scattered information from different stakeholders, from different fields, and a really complex systems understanding into kind of this distilled visualization. And so it allows users from diverse backgrounds to understand, discuss, and critique. So this map is actually about links to African elephants from market availability and consumers. It has nothing to do with small-scale fisheries, so we don't have to talk about it, but it's one really great example of how all of these connections can kind of work at play. So systems mapping, as I've just told you, is one process. And another process that I use a lot is called evidence synthesis. And this can take many forms, but a lot of folks know it from systematic reviews or narrative reviews. It can also be used in meta-analyses, and then there's other forms of evidence synthesis as well. So vote counting is a form of evidence synthesis. Conceptual models are a form of evidence synthesis. And so I'm really interested in understanding what's happening in data-poor coral reef fisheries at the present and how I can use evidence synthesis to do that. So what's already existing in the literature and how do I use that to form a baseline understanding of the system? And so if we want to be able to do systems mapping, how do we do that with evidence synthesis, right? So what if instead of stakeholders discussing that system, we want to start with a baseline understanding of the system? So what if we scratch out the stakeholders and we just put us there and our project team, and how do we then create a baseline understanding of the system to be able to discuss with them later? So that's kind of a big question of this work, right? What does the evidence, what does the peer-reviewed literature tell us already about what's happening in this system? And so for this, we focused on conceptual models, which this figure, as you can tell, looks a lot like the figure I just showed you. And this is a way that we can use evidence synthesis to distill down what's happening in the literature and see what the literature is saying about the connections in different systems. So for us, coral reef systems. And this figure is a much kind of nicer and great visual depiction of how climate change is working in a conceptual model. So if we zoom in, and I'm gonna ask you to focus kind of on the middle of the screen there, we can start at the left and we can see that sea surface temperature is linked to increased coral bleaching and a decrease in coral growth, which negatively impacts coral reef habitat, which leads to a decrease of species diversity, which can, we're still staying in the middle, impact tourism and recreation, and impact local businesses. And so that's kind of an example of a causal chain that we can find from a conceptual model. and just kind of being able to follow the system to understand how one thing impacts something else that in turn impacts something else. So in our systems level understanding of coral reef fisheries overall, we have a lot of these kind of linkages already available. So we understand that increasing sea surface temperatures globally have been linked to increasing coral bleaching. And that's kind of this idea of rising temperatures impacting these systems. We also have this understanding that ocean acidification in a myriad of ways can impact organism survival, calcification, growth, etc. And a lot of these understandings are species specific or related to one specific case. And so our research team that was with some really fantastic Vast Connection students who are co-authors on this work looked at these 6 different climate threats and how all of those climate threats are impacting coral reefs as social ecological systems. So it's these giant systems. And we also wanted to pull out a myriad of outcomes. So we wanted to pull out both social and ecological outcomes. And so to do this, we looked at animal and species level outcomes, as well as outcomes on ecological communities, and then impacts on catch, food security, livelihoods, and human well-being. So we have a whole host of climate threats and a whole host of outcomes. And I'm going to talk you through these a little bit more, just so that it makes more sense. So climate threats, there's some really fantastic frameworks on the variety of climate threats that are going on and impacting our systems globally. And the IUCN has this conservation measures partnership that gives these really fantastic classifications of all the different threats possible to ecosystems. So we pulled out the ones that are directly related to climate change, and those directly went into how we picked these 6 climate threats. These mirrored other frameworks, like frameworks from NOAA, and so we felt pretty good about kind of choosing these 6. Again, these aren't the only threats to the system, these are just the climate threats to the system, so we're not looking at pollution or deforestation or a variety of other impacts on these systems. And then for outcomes, this slide has moved slightly, but essentially, again, we're looking at both social and ecological outcomes. So impacts to fish biomass, impacts to fishing itself, impacts for charismatic megafauna or other species, as well as education and capacity building, and impacts to livelihoods. And so this outcome framework actually came from a paper where we were looking at conservation and the impacts of conservation on these systems, and we used the same outcomes, and we pulled these from, I want to say, like 6 different frameworks throughout the literature to get population species level outcomes, ecological community outcomes, outcomes on ecosystem function, ecosystem services, and then human well-being, human knowledge and behavior, and governance systems. So a really wide host of outcomes, and I'm happy to talk about this later. The conservation work, it didn't all fit for this talk. So that's how we got to these 2 different frameworks, one for climate threat and one for outcomes. And then we had to get our papers. But first we wanted to figure out subgroups. So all of these kind of climate threats and outcomes, we needed to categorize them. So we picked 4 categories, one being corals and coral reefs, one being reef fish, shellfish, and the last fisher folk and local communities. So folks that are fishing on the reefs and folks that live near the reefs and depend on them for different aspects of their livelihoods. And so again, we're kind of diving back into the peer-reviewed literature, right? So we found 275 peer-reviewed reviews, and we decided to only look at these because they're the ones that really focus on the host of all of these connections, right? We're trying to build this giant map of all of the connections in the system, so we focused on reviews. Within those, there were 19 that were selected as most relevant, both because they were highly cited and they were most relevant in terms of the variety of connections that they looked at and the wide variety on the system. We accepted 18 of those papers, and then we paired those with highly cited gray literature reviews. So we realized that with just the peer-reviewed literature, we're leaving out a lot of climate work, such as these like giant IPCC reports that look at climate impacts all over the world, and we wanted to make sure those were included. So the gray literature that we cited also cites peer-reviewed literature, it's just not peer-reviewed itself. And with that, we created this giant directed literature network. And this is what I'm going to talk to you about for a lot of the remainder of this talk. So we have all of these connections laid out here, and mapping each of these connections took a lot of time. And so I'll walk you through kind of one example of how we created this. So this is a pretty fantastic figure, which is why I pulled it out. We were looking at reviews, but this figure by Polly and Chang essentially shows that warming waters will lead to an increase in deoxygenation of oceans, and that will lead to a decrease in body size of fish. So it shows you the gills, how the gills get oxygen from the water. It's kind of a pretty fantastic figure, but I'm distilling down this example. So climate change leads to deoxygenation of oceans, which leads to decreased body size in fish. And we would map this out just like that. So depending on the depth that the authors go into or do not go into, that is the level of depth that we map. So in this, you can see that 2 of our climate impacts were increased sea surface temperature and ocean deoxygenation, and that leads to a change in fish size for these species. So many, many, many of those connections got us this map. Every single arrow on this map, many of them have multiple papers behind them that are cited, and this hopefully is going to give us kind of this new idea of how these systems are working and how everything is intertwined and entangled. So for our results, we first looked at subgroups, and this kind of makes the most sense in some ways because these subgroups were related to this, or these clusters were related to the subgroups that we had already created. So in the network, where things are spatially matters and how they're connected to each other spatially, how closely connected some things are to each other, all of that matters for kind of how we're understanding these systems. So our first cluster that we saw was related to reef fish, and it also had some connection to fisher folk and local communities. Our second cluster was related to reef fish larvae, and we actually pulled that out because recruitment and fish larvae, we'll talk about that in a second, but those are highly important for these systems, and a lot of the research looked at those. Our third cluster looked at shellfish. We had less research there. And the fourth looked at corals and coral reef impacts. And so in order to kind of understand what this means and then dive further into the map itself, we do something called a network analysis. And a network analysis helps us to basically use quantitative analysis to find key outcomes in the system, and then from that we can identify interventions that might bolster the processes surrounding these outcomes. So how do we protect reef fish? How do we protect coral reefs? Kind of, we need to analyze this first to understand the aspects of these systems most at risk to figure out how we use conservation. So, and so much of kind of this network, we have a lot of research that just says more research is needed. And again, this is kind of the why behind this work, right? We don't want to just come out of this and say, well, we need more research to understand this system. This directed literature network showcases so much of the research out there related to coral reefs and coral reef social ecological systems. And so we want to try to get any new insights we can out of the research that's already been done. So network analysis can use these many different modes of analysis, and here are 2 examples. So on the left, betweenness centrality. This is potential bottlenecks in the network. So where will things get stuck? Where will climate impacts just kind of impede these systems in a way that is hard to use conservation to fix, right? So those are potential bottlenecks where climate change could really impact the flow in the system. We also have key leverage points, and that's the eigenvector centrality. And so that yellow dot in the middle is showing a key leverage point where we might be able to kind of help the system through working through conservation to bolster that yellow dot, essentially. So that yellow dot corresponds to a node in the system, and so how do we help that node? So that could be reef fish biomass. And we could say, okay, well, reef fish biomass is then a potential network leverage point in the system. So this is a lot in theory. But in practice, I'm going to walk you through one example of how we did this. And I promise this is like the most in the weeds we'll get. So I just talked to you about eigenvector centrality, key network leverage points. And this yellow dot kind of shows, you can look at the visual and see, okay, that is in fact a node in the center of the system that can lead to so many changes in the system. So that small picture is again on the left, and we're going to talk about larval fish recruitment. And I know you can't see where larval fish recruitment is on this visual, but I want you to try to think about it if I tell you that it has a high eigenvector centrality. And I won't leave you with that for too long, but it's right there. It's essentially in the middle of this network. So much hinges upon larval fish recruitment, which essentially means these really, really young larval fish that can't swim against the water at all, how do they find their way back to coral reefs? And that replenishes these populations year after year after year. So without larval fish recruitment, recruits coming back to coral reefs, we won't have younger generation of reef fish, and then in some years to come, we won't have older generations of reef fish, which are also the mass spawners, these really important fish. They're also the biggest ones, the ones we want to catch to feed local populations. So this makes sense scientifically, right? But so much in this system and in the literature also hinges upon this very node. Larval fish recruitment also had high betweenus centrality, so we also know that it's a potential bottleneck, which again, you can see. So our top influences in the network, I just talked to you about larval fish recruitment. Coral reef quality, so coral reef rugosity, kind of this like 3D aspect of corals is the most important aspect for coral reef systems. And then fish growth rate was also found to be extremely important for reef fish. And we found very little connections between fisher folk and local communities in this research. And this is, you know, a small section of the screen here, but it's arguably one of the most important for us because we were looking at these connections. We were trying to find papers that had these connections. And so by not finding many connections, and finding a lot of connections that were kind of these broader impact statements, like a loss of reef fish will lead to decreased food security, with no papers citing it. That was pretty disheartening because this connection that we were hoping to look for, in fact, didn't really exist in a lot of peer-reviewed literature reviews. And we can understand what's happening with climate change and how it's impacting coral reefs and coral reef fish. But to understand the downstream impacts on local communities is something that's still not often studied, and if it is, it doesn't make its way into kind of these giant reviews. And so from this work, we had 3 key findings that I want to talk to you about. So the first is that coral reef social ecological systems hinge upon larval recruitment. So I just talked to you about fish larval recruitment, and there's also coral larval recruitment. And so both of these types of recruitments were endpoint nodes in the network, which meant that though lots of other nodes led to and influenced them, they in turn didn't really influence a lot of other nodes in the network. And so this, in our interpretation, represents a gap between the way that coral reef social ecological systems are scientifically understood, because we know that larval recruitment leads to so many downstream impacts, versus the way that they're presented in the literature, which is kind of being an endpoint. And this is pretty worrisome because it poses a risk for larval recruitment consideration and management planning. So if larval recruitment isn't discussed as something that keeps populations going, but is rather discussed as an endpoint, it could be a really tough sticking point in management for being able to protect and preserve good recruitment for years to come. Our second key finding was related to corals themselves and coral reef quality. So I talked about coral reef quality as being extremely important for coral reef systems, but we also found that it's key for food security outcomes, and this might seem a bit counterintuitive, but food security outcomes are all the way down here on this connection chain, And coral reef quality is up at the top left there. And so we can see that coral reef quality can impact changes in fish biomass and abundance, which can lead to changes in fish yield, and that can lead to changes in food security. So if we're really interested in food security, we need to think back all the way to coral reef quality. And so this is important because few papers have connected this coral reef quality to food security and livelihoods all the way downstream. And this is a multi-step connection that we need to consider and research and plan for in the future of climate change and for the future of these systems. And lastly, our final kind of key takeaways, and I should have said, but these are key takeaways that aren't readily presented in many papers in the literature. So we were trying to use these systems map to understand new takeaways that maybe are getting kind of forgotten about as we study coral reefs. So what are the key findings that we now understand could really help or impact coral reefs? And so the third one of these is disease prevention. And so there's a lot of work and research around preventing coral bleaching, which is hugely impactful because coral bleaching leads downstream to coral mortality. And if we want to prevent coral bleaching, the big solution there is to limit climate emissions because that's what limits ocean warming. All of these issues, all of this work, all of these maps would be solved if we, or lessened, all of the impacts would be lessened if we limited climate emissions drastically. This work is not arguing for that anymore than anything else. It's trying to kind of figure out ways that we can work with what we have in the situation that we're in. So yeah, that's just a note. Everything would be a lot easier if there was less climate emissions and thus less sea surface warming. But since that's not something in the control of folks in these systems or managers in these systems at the moment, we might need to look at other ways to prevent things like coral bleaching and coral mortality. And so to do that, we could also think about disease. So disease also leads downstream to coral mortality, and coral diseases are becoming more present as our climate is changing. However, sometimes we have more control over the spread of different diseases than we do over things like coral bleaching. And so thinking about how to mitigate and plan for spread of coral disease might help us a lot in ways that aren't being focused on as much right now. And so in conclusion, we have these key findings of the study that we hope to kind of bring new perspective to coral reef social ecological systems. The first is that coral reefs hinge upon larval recruitment in general. The second is that coral reef quality is key for food security outcomes, and we really need to be thinking about that downstream linkage. And the third is that focus on disease prevention is needed and could help us bolster coral reef systems in the future. And so there's a lot of limitations to this work when we're kind of looking at it from a bird's eye view. The big one connects kind of to what we already talked about earlier about how we want to really be integrating local knowledge into understanding these systems. This work is not doing that. This work is just looking at what the literature says. And so the literature is based on scientists' understanding of the systems that makes its way into the peer-reviewed literature. It's also focused on what's funded. And so there can be big gaps between what's in the literature and what the knowledge of the system is in general. Another thing is that we weren't looking at all of the peer-reviewed literature out there. We were only looking at the peer-reviewed literature reviews. And so that condenses kind of that mass of information into a smaller clump because we're also picking from what other scientists chose as the most important. And in that, there weren't that many connections with fisher folk and local communities. And so we have to wonder, why were people not looking at that? Does it truly not exist in the literature, or is it something that these reviews thought were beyond the scope of this research, and that's why they didn't dive into it? So that's something that we're hoping to work on a little bit more. And so the question now that I'm sure you're thinking also is, we talked about this giant network, everything that's going on with it, some of the key takeaways. What can we actually do with this? And what can we do with this in data poor systems where we really need more research? And how do we use this to create these systems that are climate aware as they kind of think about ecosystem-based fisheries management? So how do we use all of these findings to understand these systems further? And a question that we can ask with this, a conservation question, is how can local knowledge and participation and bottom-up conservation initiatives help mitigate climate threats? So this is, again, focused on local communities. It's not focused on the climate threats at a global level. So we're really thinking of small scale, how can local knowledge and participation change these systems potentially for the better? And what power do we have in these certain systems from a bottom-up level? And to do this, we can look at the conservation literature. And so this is kind of the next part of this work that's being done. So for example, this paper talks about co-development of fisheries monitoring and how this can be used to support management. So this paper is focused on research that was done in Hawaii, and they actually used lunar cycles as a way to work with local fishers who fished in response to lunar cycles to understand fisheries management and understand when spawning in fish might be occurring. And they use that to kind of work through better management practices. And so this is another kind of linkage chain, like the ones I showed you, but this is related to conservation. And so we don't have to get kind of into the weeds of all of this. But what it shows is that local knowledge integration in fisheries practices can lead to fisheries management that's co-created with local communities. And we saw that that leads to this kind of participatory fisheries monitoring in which everyone is working together, which can actually decrease fishing pressure once folks understand how their fishing is impacting the system. And that led to a change in fish size. And so we can use that. I'm like, is that fish size? Hard to see. Okay, but we can use that to then use this climate network that we just created to understand the downstream impacts that stem from that. So we can plug this into the climate impact network that we have to understand how tools in fisheries management and conservation could help bolster these systems to, say, protect food security. And with the same chain, we could use this to understand how we could protect reef fish biomass and abundance, for example. So every single piece of the literature that's using local knowledge and participation in conservation can be taken as tools and as lessons and as ways that we can help protect these systems as climate change continues. And so for the next steps, we really want to understand how, again, we can understand these data poor systems and how we can use systems mapping to do so. And the next steps of this work looks at how systems mapping can inform fisheries management overall, and ask the question of, are there aspects of local knowledge that we can integrate directly into fisheries governance, like that example I just showed you, especially in a changing climate? And can we use that to kind of prepare for the future and prevent greater impacts of climate change? So with that, thank you so much, and I'll take any questions.
So while we wait for people online, I do have a question for you. So 5 years ago, there was a quick decline in people traveling, and so a lot of areas saw an improvement in environmental factors, especially along coastlines where fish were effective and sea life. During that time, was there a slowing down potentially of bleaching of coral reef, or were some coral able to kind of recover a little bit during that time, or was there any monitoring of that? I know we had a lot of things going on 5 years ago, but I didn't know if that was something that may have been noticed.
That's a great question. And so I know that, like, COVID in many ways acted as marine protected areas for different fisheries, like all across the world, right? So essentially, in some areas, people were still going out and fishing, and they could kind of get fresh food that way when it was hard to get it otherwise. And it actually helped food security in certain places. In other areas, it's worked as a marine protected area to kind of keep people from fishing. which helped fish populations. For coral reefs, though, 2023 was a really bad bleaching year, so there wasn't there's not a big success story I can give you about sea temperatures and how it impacted sea temperatures. It kind of, it impacted those areas in terms of creating protection, but then when the waters warmed more than they had in a while, the coral still bleached quite considerably. I don't have stats on how much of the world's corals bleached in 2023, but it was pretty bad. So it's kind of like a give and take, right? Because we can work as hard as we can to prepare conservation and management measures to protect against things like that, but if corals are bleaching, there's very little we can do about it. There's like these hope and success stories from the Red Sea. They have these really resilient corals that are really resilient to kind of higher sea surface temperatures. And so they can actually rebound faster. And so folks are looking at coral genetics as a way to understand which corals might survive better. But for places like Australia, the Caribbean, so many of our other coral reefs where we just don't have those super resilient corals, bleaching didn't get better during COVID. Yeah.
So we do have one question from online. How do the findings from the literature that you presented here resonate with or contrast the findings you found from your interviews with fisher folk?
Oh, great question. So this aspect here is kind of getting at some of the later parts of my dissertation, or looking at interviews with fisher folk in 4 different sites in the Caribbean and what they're noticing and picking up on in terms of climate impacts in their system. And in those interviews, we see a lot of mention of weather changes. So hurricanes, increased storms. We also see a lot of mention of changes in water temperature and times when might not necessarily be expected. So there's varying seasonality in terms of when people are expecting the rainy season versus the drier season, when people are expecting storms versus when they're not. And that didn't show up as much in kind of these giant literature reviews. So that's really interesting because, I mean, storms also impact the entire system. You know, they can decimate coral reefs. They also impact reef fish. And depending on how they operate, things can rebound quickly or they cannot. But I wasn't expecting to see so much focus on kind of the seasonality changes. And so that local knowledge is really interesting in terms of thinking about, okay, maybe folks aren't seeing impacts of acidification, because those are kind of, ocean acidification is less seen on the ground in general. It's really hard to pick up, and we're just getting to the precipice of where it's going to be impacting these systems more. But interviews from 2011, 2012 can tell us a lot about extreme weather and ocean circulation in ways that we might not have known or thought about. So it's really interesting to think about which types of knowledge we could harness for management and which other types of climate threats people aren't really seeing.
So we have a follow-up.
Okay.
So do I understand correctly that systems thinking is a way not only of relating factors to any given system, but of relating systems to each other and mapping the vectors of impact to generate different scales, actionable synthetic knowledge, and that this can be done through meta-research in different bodies of literature?
Wow. Yes, can you read it again?
Yes. Systems thinking is a way not only of relating factors in a given system, but of relating systems to each other and mapping the vectors of impact to generate different scales, actionable synthetic knowledge, and that this can be done through meta-research in different bodies of literature.
Awesome, thank you. So it can be used in this presentation that I just kind of described to you. It's looking at just mapping one system, mapping everything we know about one system, and creating, like, where is it? Creating that giant map of understanding. We can also use it, yes, to essentially compare different systems to each other. So this could be done at global scales, but it's probably more interesting and a lot more feasible at local scales. So we could look at knowledge systems. We could look at knowledge systems in 2 different places in the Caribbean, for example, and look at how folks in these communities are seeing climate change impacts there. And we could create 2 different maps. Again, they would probably be much more distilled down than this because it's just what folks are seeing on the ground. And then we could compare those 2 maps and say, okay, well, some people are seeing this and noticing this, and others are noticing the same thing here, but different things here. We could also compare maps like that to this giant literature base to understand the difference between what's in the peer-reviewed literature and what folks are seeing on the ground. So there's a lot of different ways that systems mapping can be used, and I just gave you an example of how I'm using it, but it's not often used to map out the literature in general. So to do something kind of this chaotic is not necessarily how systems mapping is used. It's often used in this co-creative process, or at least that's a lot of the work that I've looked at. It's used to bring stakeholders together and to ask them about their understandings of a system and create understandings of a system that work for everyone kind of from that, more so than it's used to distill the literature, because like this is just extremely confusing. So that might not be the first way that people use it, but I'm hoping to use it starting with this to then look at the contrast of what people know. And that's why I'm using that really complex system. Great questions.
Great presentation, Nana. I want to say actually it's really cool that you've used this kind of mapping to look at literature, because otherwise reading meta-analyses and reviews can be really dense and not easy to understand the big tables. So I think this is a great representation of existing literature. I was just wondering, is there a way to like assign weights to the nodes, or is that something that might be meaningful to look at?
Amazing. Great question. Thank you. This is like the common question of academics, because we love, like you have like meta-analyses and your different reviews, and you want to know, okay, well, what's most important, right? And not only what's most important, but how much more important is one connection versus another. And so if we were assigning weights to this map, for example, we could use thicknesses. So the lines would just be different thicknesses depending on the weights of an impact. The reason why I'm not assigning weights is because, well, actually many. So one is that if I was looking just at meta-analyses, right, then I could assign weights. Those focus on very specific parts of the system. And I really wanted the system overview. Another part of weighting is that it often leaves out social science. Sadly enough, it's like the social science wasn't really represented in this work anyway. But one of the whole points that I wasn't looking at quantitative impacts is because the social science tends to just be qualitative, or it might give examples, and not all. Some social science is, of course, quantitative, but I didn't want to leave out anything, which a big limitation of this work is that I think by picking the reviews that we picked, it still left that out. We do have, like I have the data, and I could weight things based off of how many reviews showed a connection. So this connection, there were 4 reviews, and each review cited a different paper. So I can do that. I think what that still does is it puts the focus on the literature versus the focus on the system. And so I think I've also had a lot of trouble with like where to focus this work. Do we want to focus on the system itself, how it's working, or do we want to focus on what is the literature the most focused on? And those are 2 different questions. and I'm more interested in how it's working, but I'm using the literature. So it's kind of like a catch-22 a little bit with the weighting that way. But yeah, I could take it and do something like this many papers, showcase this, and I'm kind of debating that as well. Would love to chat.
I get your point about why you don't want to use weights.
There's also a lot of connections, but that's
Yeah. I also had a sort of similar question to what was asked from someone on Zoom. Can these sort of like systems models be adaptively updated with indigenous knowledge or local knowledge? And then I think it would be really cool to see how much more or what different information like local knowledge adds to this, which the literature just doesn't.
yes. Yes. So
And I think you're already going to do that, so.
yes, but it's like that's a really fun question too, in terms of also how, like if we're adapting these maps, how do we do that and how do we compare? And so before this looked like this, my idea was to do interviews asking people which connections they agreed with or not. And that's like too much. And then I tried to kind of aggregate different nodes together to be like, okay, if I make this map more simple, then would that be something I could ask people about? But the reason why I've switched it is because I actually think the open-ended questions of like, how is the weather impacting you in fishing and these systems? How is climate change impacting you? 'Cause some people also, they'll resonate with the weather questions and they'll answer them as related to climate change, but then the climate change questions, they'll be like, oh, I don't see it. So that's been really interesting to me in the interviews that already existed, where it's just an open-ended question and people are giving you the impacts that they're most readily seeing, and you're not fishing for any connections that they're not giving you. And so I think it'll be really interesting to take those interviews and overlay them with this map and say, people are only seeing these connections and or they're seeing this downstream connection that in the literature goes through like 3 things. But they just see the warming water and then this change in biomass. And it's like, well, a change in biomass could also be connected to overfishing, pollution. So it's kind of trying to figure out, what are people seeing? Do we think that was related just to climate impacts? And then if so, can we use that type of knowledge later on? It's a little tricky right now.
Thank you so much. My question, maybe first of all, I was late, and you cover it already, and that will be related a little bit. I'm not from your field. I'm more social science. Will be something about the data. You basically talk about the literature review, and have you seen some same places come out from your reading, and like the impact or the pollution, and they mention the same places in your literature when you are reading, and what motivates you? Is it going back for field work in Caribbean? Does it come from your reading, your literature review? Yeah.
Okay, so kind of what motivates these questions, and how is that coming from, like, why am I using the literature for these questions? Is that essentially, does that distill it down?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's global, the phenomenon, or it's just some places which are more affected in your reading?
Okay, great question. So I was looking, I'll go back a lot. This might be a lot, actually, sorry. So sorry, everyone. I was looking just at these global peer-reviewed reviews for this work. And one of the reasons I actually did that is so the interviews are from the Caribbean that I'll be working with later. And so I pulled out every time a review said, the specific area where that research was done. So if it said, in St. Croix, we looked at fish biomass, and then I would kind of make a note of that. One of the things that I found really difficult about the physiology aspect of this work, so I started with this interest in fish physiology. So how is climate change impacting fish physiology, mainly to get to this idea of, are fish going to be bigger, smaller? How is the biomass going to change? Like, I started with the question kind of just like that, and then how does that impact fisheries? And from that, I realized that a lot of that research was done on the Great Barrier Reef, for example, or in totally different places of the world, but they had key research on different physiological impacts. So that made me say, okay, I don't think there's enough research here to focus just on field work in one area. I feel like I should focus on the entire shallow coral reef systems and the literature on those. And that is kind of the backstory of why then it became peer-reviewed reviews, because the amount of peer-reviewed publications on how climate change impacts coral reef systems are not feasible for me to read and make connections from. And a lot of these reviews, they had so many connections in them that then I'm just going back again and again to be like, did I miss something here? Did I miss something with corals? The other reason that it expanded globally in the understanding of the research that we have. And then it also expanded into these groups of corals, reef fish, shellfish, and then of course fisherfolk, local communities. I was interested in fish and local communities, but then I'm kind of thinking about the system in a vacuum in another way, aren't I? So if I want to get a diagram like this and really understand the interactions, a big one is habitat. And so it's kind of like you can't understand what's happening to reef fish the same if their habitat is depleted. And then shellfish I didn't want to leave out. And then like spiny lobster are so important. They're such important fisheries. Queen conch is such an important fishery. So, and there's lots of different shellfish that are important in different areas of the world. So it's kind of like, if I'm adding back in coral, I have to add back in shellfish. And that's how you got, that's the reverse engineering of how I got to this giant map. Thank you. Good question.
All right. If there aren't any other questions, I think we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you, Dana. Let's give Dana another round of applause.